Hello, and welcome to episode 67 of the Sci-Fi Podcast from Bloomington, Indiana. I'm Nick Zoutra. On today's podcast, I am pleased to welcome Dr. Thomas Pradeu, CNRS Senior Investigator and head of the group Conceptual and Theoretical Analysis of Immune Activation and Biological Boundaries at the University of Bordeaux. Thomas's work deals with philosophy of biology and conceptual theoretical biology. His research focuses on philosophy of immunology, microbiology, developmental biology, and physiology, often at the interface between philosophy of biology and the philosophy of medicine. Thomas is the principal investigator of the European Research Council-funded project Immunity, Development, and the Microbiota, Understanding the Continuous Construction of Biological Identity. The problem of biological identity, that is, what counts as one individual organism, and what makes each individual organism the same, though it constantly changes through time, has a long history both in philosophy and in science. Recent data coming from immunology, microbiology, and developmental biology may revolutionize our conception of the construction of biological identity through time by showing that this construction depends crucially on environmental factors and, most importantly, on a constant dialogue with symbiotic microorganisms integrated into the organism, the microbiota. The Immunity, Development, and the Microbiota project aims at exploring how research done on the microbiota at the interface between developmental biology, microbiology, and immunology impacts our conception of biological identity and provides a new understanding of the way living things are continuously constructed through time and how they interact with their biotic environment. And thus, without further ado, let's bring in Thomas. Dr. Thomas Pradeu, welcome to the Sci-Fi Podcast. How are you this morning, afternoon?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
I'm doing very well, actually. Things are nice in Bloomington. The spring is finally here. We actually have a spring this year, so that is a very positive aspect of the weather out here. How about you? Where are you calling us from?
Well, you mean where I'm originally from?
Well, I'm curious where we're corresponding. We actually didn't chat about that. So where are you currently residing?
Oh, currently I'm in Bordeaux. So okay. The city with pretty good wines. You probably and we have
heard about Bordeaux
weather at the moment. So yeah, it's a very nice spring at the moment in Bordeaux.
Fantastic. And what have you been up to recently in terms of research, teaching? What's been going on?
So I became in 2014, I became a full-time researcher at the CNRS. So it means that I don't teach much. I mean, I used to teach quite a lot because I was an associate professor at the Sorbonne, and I moved to Bordeaux and at the same time to the CNRS, which is a full-time research institute. So now I don't teach too much, or what I do mainly is to do research and to organize the research of the group that I am coordinating here in our institute.
Fantastic. Okay, great. And so this is the particular institute. I'm looking a little bit about it because it seems like you're familiar. You're coordinated with a lot of really great groups. It looks like so. There's the Immunoconcept Group, Institute for Philosophy and Biology and Medicine. Are these all of these things at Purdue, or are they kind of spread around?
So it's a very good and very important point. So I am part of the main immunology lab here in Bordeaux, and this lab is called Immunoconcept. So it is not only about conceptual and philosophical aspects, but we have in that lab, we have four main groups. One of which is devoted to conceptual and philosophical questions in connection with immunology, medicine, and other biological fields. So that's the lab of which I am part. And in parallel, we created 3 years ago this institute called Institute for Philosophy in Biology and Medicine, which is both a local institute that puts together different scientists, medical doctors, and philosophers in Bordeaux. But at the same time, that institute is also a network that connects different institutes in the world, which share the same aims that we have, which is to precisely connect philosophy, biology, and medicine. So it means that the network has members which are in the US, others which are in Australia, others which are in the UK, etc., etc. So we try to have something that is both local and very international.
Wow. Okay. And I'm really curious to hear about how this. Well, let's ask now. How did this come to be? How did this network? What is a little bit about the history of it?
Yeah, so it's a pretty recent history, but the first question to me was to what extent philosophy can and should be useful to science. So that is a question that I have struggled with in the last years. And when I decided to move to Bordeaux in 2014, as I said, the decision was really made to go to a biology lab. We are part of the biology department, and we are also, in fact, health sciences and biology department, and we are also part of the hospital here, the local hospital here in Bordeaux. So that was a personal move, and at the same time, I realized that many philosophers, in fact, have thought about that, about how we can collaborate with scientists and medical doctors, and how we can maybe make a difference sometimes to the science itself. And for that reason, I started to think quite a lot about that, and I started to do all sorts of connections with other people. For example, Paul Griffiths in Sydney has been thinking about that issue for a long time. Ken Schaffner at Pittsburgh has, had all sorts of influence on medicine and biology. So I started to think that it would be nice to create a network. The main aim of which would be to do that. To think about the possible connections between philosophy, biology, and medicine.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Was there a particular other kind of network with which this was modeled on? Like in another kind of science, the way this is connected? Or was this kind of a new way of doing things?
So I don't know if there is anything equivalent, but many things were inspiring. So, for example, with my colleague, Maël Lemoine, who is a philosopher of medicine, we often use that comparison. Many biologists and medical doctors at the moment, they perfectly understand that they should do a little bit of math and a little bit of statistics to do their own work.
Right.
And our own conviction is that we could, in a certain sense, not reduce philosophy to that, but we could add to other philosophical, add to some of the classic tools of philosophy. We could also consider that philosophy can be a toolbox for biologists and medical doctors. And from that point of view, the analogy with the math and statistics is a little bit of the same. One of the things that we thought could be useful in that network was to involve not only philosophers who are very interested in biology and medicine, but also practicing scientists, practicing MDs, and ask them, what do you expect from philosophy? And from that point of view, we thought that it was pretty useful to use the toolbox analogy, like saying, sometimes philosophy can be used as a toolbox to think better or to think differently about the very concepts or the very questions that you see in your daily life as a scientist or as a medical doctor. So to go back to your question, I don't know if there was something like a model, but clearly there are many different ways of doing interdisciplinary studies, and we were clearly inspired by some of them when we developed that idea that it would be useful to have an institute in philosophy of biology and medicine.
Wow. Fantastic. Well, I'm eager to hear more about the research that is going on currently and the projects you're interested in. But before we do that, let's take a step back and learn a little bit about how you got into philosophy of science and philosophy in biology and medicine in the first place, Thomas. So tell us a little bit about where you grew up.
So I grew up in a very small city, which also does wine, but there are less. I mean, those wines are not as famous as the ones of Bordeaux. The small city is called Cahors. It's just in the southwest of France, very small city. And it's only when I was 18 that I went to Paris and did mainly my university studies in Paris.
Okay. What were some of your interests growing up before? I mean, how did, in terms of wanting to do philosophy, was that something that you had always wanted to do? Was this something, what else what were you interested in?
So I was mainly interested in literature, broadly speaking, and in France, as in other countries, a small number of other countries, we all do philosophy at the last step of high school studies. So in the normal background in the classic background of any high school student in France, philosophy will be included. So in my case, it was an excellent philosophy professor at the very last year of high school that convinced me that rather than literature, I should probably study philosophy.
Really? What was the argument there?
Well, it is very difficult to say because mainly the point was, of course, the kind of questions that are raised by philosophy, which, really resonated to me. And I'm really talking here about very classic philosophical questions, about the existence of the external world, about God, about, very classic philosophical questions. And I thought it was very difficult to say something precise about that. But at the same time, I really liked the idea of raising those questions. So, I was kind of fascinated by the very topics. And the professor was very good, very clear, very, straightforward in the argument. So I wouldn't say that I agreed much with what he said, but I really loved the questions.
Yeah. Very nice. Very nice. Okay. So, all right. So then in deciding to get into philosophy, how did you go about doing that?
I'm absolutely sorry, but we have an helicopter at the hospital, and sometimes I cannot hear you.
I was wondering what that was. I was like, "Are you in an airfield?" But that makes sense. There's so
makes what I told you about the hospital very real. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. This is like a real. Yeah, you're getting all the real experience of that. Okay. No, what I was just curious about is, in deciding to get into philosophy. So how did you go about? So you were convinced to get into philosophy. What were some of the next steps you took to go in and or pursue that?
So a very important aspect is that in France, we often not go directly into philosophy as such. So what I did is a very interdisciplinary, I had a very interdisciplinary background that included philosophy, but also math, history, all sorts of other literature, all sorts of other topics. This is the system that we call Grandes Écoles in France. The name doesn't matter, but it is a system which is parallel to the university system.
Yep.
And it's only after 3 years often that we decide to focus on one topic. So this is what I did. So I did this. I joined the École Normale Supérieure, and then I decided to do philosophy. So in a way, I decided pretty late. I mean, until 21 years old, I had not decided to do philosophy 100% of my time. And it's only, at that time that I decided to do philosophy. But still, I mean, the whole time I knew that philosophy would certainly be the main topic of my, own reflection. So yeah, that's the move I made. And the reason why I did that was simply that, again, the very questions raised by philosophy were extremely interesting to me. I really like that. We do a lot, I would say too much of history of philosophy in France. Philosophy is 95% of history of philosophy. I think we do a little bit too much, but I was kind of fascinated by many of the, big names in philosophy, big authors of the past. That was very important to me.
Yeah. Okay. And so, so in terms of the particular kind of philosophy you wanted to get into, how did your path take you toward philosophy of science?
So it was very slow. I didn't want to do philosophy of science in the first place. I didn't really like it. I didn't really know what it was. And I must say it was not it was not very strong. Philosophy of science was not very strong as part of the main curriculum in philosophy. So I think that France has very good philosophers of science, but not so many of them. So it means that you're not necessarily exposed to these excellent philosophers of science in your curriculum. So philosophy of science was not my first choice in the beginning. So what I did was mainly to study ancient Greek, and I worked on Plato and Aristotle for some time, especially on Plato. And then I had one of these crazy competitive exams that we have in France, where in fact you're supposed to learn a lot about different aspects of history of philosophy. And because of that, because of this competitive exam, I was really convinced that I didn't want to do history of philosophy anymore. I really wanted to do general philosophy in the sense that I wanted to raise questions about concepts, not so much about what people said in the past, but more about what I could try to say in the present about something that would be an important philosophical issue. So to someone who lives in the US, it sounds pretty obvious, but in France, again, 95% of all the courses you get in philosophy are history of philosophy courses. And I really wanted to do something different. And I remember that I really liked biology in high school. And I met people and I said, this is what I want to do. I want to do philosophy and biology together. And this is really through that I realized there was this whole world of philosophy of science, all its literature and all its debates, which I found then fascinating.
Oh, very cool. Very cool. All right, so it sounds okay. And once you've come to this point of understanding the combining biology and philosophy, I guess tell us a little bit about your graduate training.
So at that point, because I was in this very interdisciplinary school where you could do different things at the same time, when I said I want to do biology and philosophy together, very nice people told me, well, you should, in parallel with your master in philosophy, you should get a master in biology at the same time. This was not completely possible in the end for me. What I did was to do a lot of the teachings in the master in biology where I was, and I specialized in immunology, parasitology, and virology. So it was pretty much specialized back, already at that time. So I don't have technically a second master in science, but I validated many of the different courses that were part of that master. So I entered that way of doing interdisciplinary studies in a strong way, because I was like in the middle of biology students doing their master. So clearly they were much better than I was, but I tried to do my best to do in parallel philosophy and biology.
Yeah. So you mentioned immunology, and this is a theme in a particular research that you're currently doing. What brought you to your interest in immunology?
So so when I decided that I wanted to do some biology and some philosophy, I remembered that I really liked my high school courses in immunology, which were not very complex, but they were very interesting to me. And one thing that I found extremely interesting was the centrality of the concept of self and non-self in immunology. So, of course, to me, now trained as a philosopher, those concepts of self and non-self sounded as much like philosophical concept as immunological concept. So I started to be interested in why exactly do immunologists use those concepts of self and non-self? Does it come from psychology? Does it come from philosophy? And I started to be interested in the history of how those concepts became integrated and adopted in immunology. And there I found the book of Fred Tauber, The Immune Self Theory or Metaphor, which was published in 1994. And this book is exactly about the history of how immunologists, in fact, took that concept of self and non-self from philosophy and then said, we're going to say something precise, useful about that concept of self and non-self. So really the beginning was understanding how a philosophical concept can be imported into such a strongly experimental science as immunology and be considered as a useful concept by immunology.
Yeah. So could you tell us maybe a little bit about then how you've seen it be useful in the sense, or how you've argued that it's such?
Yeah, so in my own work, I have been pretty critical with the concept of self and non-self, but still, the first step was to understand what was going on with these concepts and why they were adopted. And the main reason why they were adopted was that the people who suggested the self-non-self framework, mainly in the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s, they said, this is the best concept if we want to understand why at the same time you're going to reject a pathogen and a graft. So after the First World War, people tried to do many types of transplantations. They wanted to do some transplants, skin transplants, different sorts of transplants. And they realized much more than it was thought before that in many cases, most cases, in fact, the body is going to reject something which is foreign, while at the same time it is going to tolerate something which is an autograft, so a graft of someone on this very same someone. And this was really the starting point for immunologists to think in terms of self and non-self, and their interpretation of that was the immune system is clearly a system that detects what is me and what is foreign to me. And that sounded to me completely fascinating, a little bit weird as well. I was a little bit suspicious of that vocabulary of foreignness in a biological science. But that was for me the starting point, being interested in what do they mean exactly when they talk about self, individuality, and identity. No,
I'm sorry. I think we might have lost you.
Oh no, I'm still here.
Oh, okay. Go. Oh, yeah.
So I think that was really for me what was interesting, and then I started to offer what I thought was a critique of this idea. Not so much that I do think that immunology has much to say about biological individuality, what it means to be a biological individual, but I started to offer a critique of the idea that biological individuality should be reduced to the question of origin. That is something foreign or not foreign? So I don't think the immune system discriminates between what is foreign and what is not foreign, but I do think that the immune system plays a very important role in our concept of what a biological individual is.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. Okay, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Well, I have a number of questions about this, but perhaps I'll come to those in a little bit. So in terms of your early work on this and doing some work from earlier in biology, so what were some of your first professional positions? You mentioned that you don't teach now, but you used to teach. So how did you go from doing some of your graduate training and work and getting into working as a philosopher of science?
Mm-hmm. So I did my PhD at the Sorbonne University in Paris. So before that, I spent 1 year at Harvard University in the History of Science department and Philosophy department. So then I did PhD. Yeah, so then I did my PhD under the supervision of Jean Gaillon, who was a very influential and important philosopher of science in France. And then I got my first position as an associate professor at the Sorbonne in 2008. And I stayed there for 6 years in a very classic and I must say very good philosophy department, where philosophy of science is pretty small. It was pretty small because the rest was pretty big. We were 45 permanent faculty, so it's a big philosophy department. And yeah, I spent 6 wonderful years there trying to do all sorts of philosophical work, connections with my colleagues in philosophy, and also connections with scientists. And this is only when I decided that I wanted to do even stronger connections with biologists that I decided to apply to a CNRS position, which, as I said before, the CNRS offers something which is absolutely unique in the world, which is permanent positions to do research all the time. So it is a permanent full-time research position. It's just some sort of sabbatical for your whole life. And this is very good, I must say.
The dream. That's great. That's really fascinating. Okay. Well, so all right. So it sounds like you've had a lot of great success and in an excellent position. Why don't you take the time perhaps to tell us a little bit about some of your most influential works? And what I mean by most influential, those with papers and or projects that you feel like have had either a great impact on the field or have had a great impact on you as a thinker, as a philosopher of science, as a biologist. Perhaps maybe 1, 2, 3 projects, something like that.
So for me, my book, The Limits of the Self, was something important because I spent a lot of time working on it. And that book got the Lakatos Award 3 years ago. And that was, for me, nice recognition because when you work on philosophy of immunology, you're clearly not part of the mainstream topic of philosophy of science.
Right.
Even though, of course, I tried to connect my own questions to, more classic and important questions in philosophy of science and in philosophy of biology. So for me, it was it was good surprise to see that this work has had some recognition. I wouldn't say it is a famous book, certainly not, but
sure.
It was a lot of work for me, and it was one way of for me saying that putting together philosophy and immunology in sometimes pretty technical ways, because part of the book is pretty technical because it is also about immunology and also, I must say, for immunologists. So it's a book that is supposed to be read, if possible, both by philosophers and immunologists. So clearly that is one thing that was important for me, at least in the way I invested my energy in it. Another thing is my paper called What is an Organism? An Immunological Answer, which is a short paper, which in fact I did while I was preparing my PhD dissertation. I had a very good friend, a logician, and I said, I'm stuck somewhere in my main chapter in my PhD. This is really one thing I want to do, and I don't know how to solve the main problems I have. And he told me, write a paper about it. Instead of thinking in terms of chapter, think in terms of paper, try to submit a paper, try to get some feedbacks. And this is what I did, and this is that paper, What is an Organism? And I find so many problems now with that paper that I wouldn't say I still everything. Well, of course, because, you necessarily become very critical with yourself when you go back to something. So that was published in 2010. And of course, I would then say the same things the same way now. But it was for me an important way of saying, right now in 2009 or 2010, this is what I think about how immunology is central to think about biological individuality and the concept of the organism. So that, I think, was important to me. And the last one maybe is the very recent paper that we published with different philosophers and scientists. It is called Why Science Needs Philosophy, and it was published in PNAS, so Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, the scientific journal. And we invested a lot of energy in that because that paper was some sort of manifesto in which we, scientists and philosophers together, try to convey that message that philosophy can be useful for science and can play a role in science itself. So yeah, that would be the third contribution I would cite, even though I don't know yet if that paper will have any influence on philosophy or on science, because it's a very recent paper. Right.
Okay. So what are some of your current projects you're working on?
So at the moment, we are as a group, we are working very hard on microbiota and biological individuality. So we are very interested in something that has become quite interesting for many scientists and philosophers recently, which is called the microbiota or the microbiome, which is mainly the set of microbes that live in us or on us, and trying to understand exactly what can be the redefinition of biological individuality that could be triggered by paying attention to those current studies on the microbiota. So here again, you find an example of something that we do, which is very strongly connected with the science and with medical considerations. But our question is very philosophical. Our question is, to what extent thinking about host microbiota interactions change our conception of what a biological individual is, what its boundaries are, what makes its identity through time, etc., etc. So that's one of the main projects on which we are collectively working. And then I have another on cancer. I can tell you more about this if you're interested.
Yeah.
So that is an attempt to better think about the interactions between the immune system and cancer. So you probably heard that the most recent Nobel Prize in medicine was for what is called cancer immunotherapies. And in fact, this Nobel Prize is the reflection or the consequence, rather, of decades of work on how the immune system and cancer interact. So this sounds very biological and very medical, but I think it has all sorts of important consequences. And the main consequence, I think, is that cancer has been conceptualized by many philosophers and some biologists as a decohesion of the individual. The idea being that a multicellular individual is a cohesive entity of different cells that cooperate in the interest of the whole, as it is often put. And cancer would be the sign that some cells or some lineages of cells stop accepting the rules of the system and reproduce for their own advantage without following the rules of what's normally going on in a multicellular organism. And I think that this is pretty promising, but this is also very vague. So I've tried to determine more precisely what could be the meaning of that idea and what could be. So if I'm right that the immune system plays an important role in individuality, then what are the connections between cancer as a de-individuation phenomenon and the influence of the immune system on maintaining biological individuality? Again, very, very scientific, and it is clearly connected with scientific work and medical work. But also, I do think that behind that, the philosophical questions that are raised are very classic philosophical questions about what it means to be a unit or to create a unity in the word. And this is a question that Aristotle, for example, raised many times in his writing. So we're not so far from the very questions that really drove me into philosophy in the first place.
Oh, that's fascinating. So great. So that sounds like some really great work coming along. I wanted to ask you actually about a recent co-authored paper you published with a number of other scientists and philosophers in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. It was an opinion piece on why science needs philosophy. This got circulated around amongst definitely philosophers of science, other philosophers, and I imagine some scientists. So I was curious about like a little bit of the history of like how this co-authored piece came to be. What were your intentions and goals, and then how it's been received?
So it's been in my mind for a long time. I really wanted to say something that could work as making explicit what has been implicit for me and other philosophers of science for a long time. So the very simple idea was to say, often people consider philosophy and science as two different things. But many would consider that they have had some strong interactions in the past, but many now will say that today's those interactions are clearly less numerous than in the past. And then the next step is that very often people will consider that it is extremely rare for philosophy to have any impact on science. And I wanted to show that it was not true. And we know from different examples that sometimes philosophy has had a strong impact on science, even recently. So then I really started to have long conversations with my very good friend, Lucie Laplane. Lucie Laplane is the first author on that paper. And she is a philosopher of science who is also embedded in a scientific lab, and she does experiments herself. So we really think that philosophy can be embedded into science and medical environments. And what we started to think is, how could we explain that in very simple terms? And the best way to do that, we thought, was to gather philosophers and scientists who have themselves an experience of working with the other community. So, for example, finding scientists who very explicitly said philosophy can be important. So one co-author, for example, on that paper is Alberto Mantovani, who is a major Italian immunologist. And Alberto has written papers where many references are to philosophers, for example. So David Hall or others are, Mantovani has, as people who have had an important contribution. So we decided to put together these scientists who think that philosophy is important. Another example, very obvious, is Carlo Rovelli. Carlo Rovelli is a physicist who has used philosophy in his own work for a very long time. And we wanted to connect these scientists to philosophers who do a lot of their research in science journals. So they publish their work in science journals. And we wanted really to share our experience of how it is possible to put together philosophy and science and try to make a contribution to science itself. So in the paper, we took 3 examples where we think that philosophical thinking has had some impact on science. We're certainly not saying that it has been a revolution in science. We are saying, this is an example or these are examples where the influence of philosophy and philosophers on science has been, pretty significant.
Yep. Yeah, that's incredible. So I'm really curious about, and I agree with all of this, and I'm really appreciate the efforts and the considerable effort to make explicit what is implicit. I think this is something that philosophers of science, I think, ideally wished would be useful to do a little bit more of. It's just not done enough, and I think that would be helpful. So I really applaud, and especially the co-authorship of this with the kind of grouping. I think it's like a really good combination of mix. I'm curious that, like, if you've chatted then with other scientists or other philosophers you've forwarded the opinion piece to, or have heard back, and what their take is. What has been the response so far?
So many different responses. So many people are very positive regarding the general idea of having strong interactions between philosophy and science. That's pretty clear, and many people support that, including philosophers embedded in scientific labs and all that. So that from that point of view, we got a lot of positive support, and that was very good to hear that. A second reaction, which we thought was a bit of a misinterpretation, was so many people telling us, yeah, everybody does that. And this is not true. So, I mean... Yeah, so we got a little bit of that. And if you go into the details of that paper, the examples we give, clearly not every philosopher, or clearly not every philosopher of science can be considered as someone doing a contribution to science or a scientific contribution. I do not ignore the difficulty of defining what counts as a scientific contribution, but right. I mean, we know examples. So like Elliot Solber, for example, is one of the co-authors of that PNAS paper, and clearly Elliot is sometimes cited by biologists as having done a major contribution to biology, and they explain what they mean by that. And I think that is the kind of things we wanted to describe in that paper. Examples where philosophy in itself, by itself, makes a difference to science as such. So there was a little bit of misunderstanding regarding this remark. Oh yeah, everybody does that. So we think that it is not true that everybody does that. So that's one important point. And then we got all sorts of reactions which we did expect, and I think they are important, about the practical recommendations that we make at the end of the paper. So at the end of the paper, we say very basic things could be done to improve the dialogue between philosophers and scientists. And we got a lot of reactions about that, and those reactions were very useful.
Oh, good. So what are some of these recommendations?
So the recommendations are very simple. So we say things like, it could be very easy for big scientific conferences to devote 1 or 2 slots in their big program to philosophers or historians of science. Like to say, you can apply, you are invited to apply. Yep. And that's one thing which is extremely simple, but extremely rare. I mean, still pretty rare at the moment. Of course, you find all sorts of exceptions, but in general, this is rare because scientists do not even think about that possibility. As I said, many exceptions, but this is often the case. We also recommended something which is also very simple, which is that big science journals could have a section devoted to history and philosophy of science, for example, and that would be very easy. That could be quite, selective in the sense that not everything is going to be accepted as an important paper about that aspect, but we thought that could be possible. We also insisted on the possibility to develop embedded philosophers in scientific labs. So this is something where indeed the idea is to spend quite a lot of time, or maybe to stay permanently, as I do, in a scientific lab. We also suggested that in curricula, we could adopt something that already exists in the US, for example, which is to have a major and a minor, something which is extremely normal in the US, but very rare in Europe. I mean, pretty rare in Europe. Yep. And it's a list of recommendations of that sort. There are maybe there are eight of them, but this is the kind of recommendations we make. And people,
what kind of major and minor? I'm just curious.
So one thing we say is that it would be absolutely fantastic if a significant number of scientists with a major in, for example, biology, could have a minor in history and philosophy of science, or in philosophy more generally. And that is something that is not so frequent in Europe. So it is very difficult in Europe to do science and philosophy together. And we think that this should be different. We also think that PhD programs could have one module or one course about history and philosophy of science, which could be very useful to science PhD students or even to medical doctors. And again, this is not something that is so frequent in the world. So we think that those very simple ways of making scientists aware that philosophy of science exists first, and second, it can be useful to their own thinking.
Fantastic. Fantastic. I could ask, is there anything in particular, so I love these recommendations, is there anything particular in your own practice or in your colleague, your sort of immediate colleagues' practice that you see of actually enacting some of these recommendations? Are there certain actions or things that you're doing in your own research program or related connections that you're in terms of encouraging this kind of thing to have happening?
I think it's probably something that should be implemented with different tools at the same time and different steps. So, for example, what I have found most rewarding in my own experience is something I have done twice, which is to be the supervisor, the PhD supervisor of a biologist.
Oh, wow.
So this is super cool, but also difficult. So what we do here in the lab, so as I said, we did it once, and now we have another example at the moment of a biologist, and she is supervised by me and by a biologist. So we did that. So I am formally the supervisor, but in fact we are two supervisors, and we try to really show every day that it makes a difference to your scientific work to have two supervisors, one in philosophy and one in biology. So what we do, which is extremely demanding, is to meet very often and to talk about exactly what's going on in the lab in terms of experiments, what could be done, why maybe the initial question was not raised in the proper way. So how can we change the very question with which we started? How can we use different definitions of the conceptual aspects of that scientific work to maybe change orientations? So this is something which I have found absolutely fantastic because you can really see the kind of influence that you can have. For example, when you say, oh, let's redefine that and now do the experiments, or experiments that you would never have done, you do them because you ask the question differently, or you ask a different question, or you redefine the very concepts that initially seem very easy to define, but in fact they are not easy to define. So for example, you distinguish two ways of defining one important scientific word, and it will lead to very different experiments in the lab. So I thought that that was extremely useful. But of course, the problem is that now we must be sure that these PhD students will find good positions. And this is where the tricky part comes. We have had a lot of fun, but now I'm very preoccupied. I think things are going to go well, but for the moment I'm a little bit preoccupied by the fact that maybe those PhD students could have more difficulties finding a postdoc position or a more permanent position in the future, because everyone talks about interdisciplinary studies, but when you explain that maybe you did less experiments because you were more thinking also in terms of conceptual considerations, then what's going to happen to those biology students is really a question for me. So I'm describing something which I found both great and also a little bit challenging.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, thank you. No, I think that's a really encouraging step forward, and something with which these kind of solutions are going to beget other challenges as well, I think, especially just disciplinary challenges and how to do this kind of work. That's really fascinating. But it's great to see folks like yourself really addressing those and taking those kinds of things on. And speaking of challenges, why don't we get to the final question that I have been asking the guests, which is, what do you take to be the greatest challenge facing philosophy of science today?
So it is very, very close to what we just discussed. So to me, the big challenge is to move from, not to move, but to add to classic philosophy of science, to add to that what I call philosophy in science. So I think it's very important to use philosophy in science, certainly not as the only possible direction for philosophy of science, but as one very important direction. And this cannot be reduced to, we should have interactions with scientists. Yes, we should have interactions with scientists, but what I'm talking about is something that is much more integrated than that. And to give you an example, I think that it is important that we philosophers publish papers in science journals, as I said before. And I think that requires skills and methods that are a little bit different from those we are used to. And I think that way of rethinking philosophy of science as something that includes philosophy in science is really, to me, the big challenge. Because, as we just discussed, it's not just a nice direction, it's also, or a nice orientation, it is also something that creates all sorts of new challenges. So how are we going to train scientists to include some philosophy of science? How are we going to train philosophers to have also a background in science? How is it going to work? If you do philosophy in science, very often, I have experienced that myself, your colleagues in philosophy start saying, oh, but this is not philosophy anymore. So this is something I have experienced myself. If you go quite deep in working with scientists, publishing with scientists, even though you think this is still philosophy because the philosophical questions are still very strong. At least you feel in what you're doing. Some people will say, oh, this is not philosophy anymore. So what I think is a major challenge is really to do some philosophy in science without completely forgetting what we are, which is, we are philosophers, and we must, defend the idea that philosophy is absolutely crucial, is one way of thinking about things, but that discipline, I think, can be used to shed light on all sorts of different domains, including the sciences, and that, I think, is really important and really challenging.
So, could you take a moment to distinguish between and or draw the similarities to an in-practice approach? When you say philosophy in science, and then we've heard of, the Society for Philosophy of Science in practice, I have a hunch that there's a little bit, you're getting at something a bit different.
Yes. I think there are many common points, and this is very important to emphasize them, but there are also many differences. And one very important difference is that a lot of philosophy in science is directly interventionist. And by interventionism, what I mean is that philosophers say, if I do philosophy in science, I will try to make a difference to science itself, which means that I would try, of course, it is very difficult to succeed, but I would try to change the science on which I work.
Yeah.
I mean, to make a contribution to it and therefore to change it a little bit.
Yeah.
And some people doing philosophy of science in practice do exactly that,
Sure.
but others have been pretty descriptive, which is also very good. I mean, this is also very important, but very often philosophy of science in practice has been a way of saying to philosophers, you have all sorts of abstract conceptions about science, but this is not how it works in practice. So go to a lab, you will see that this is not how science works.
Right.
And I think they did a great job in doing that. But we are, as philosophers in science, we are interested in something different, which is to say, we can change those practices, we can modify them, we can influence them because we have some conceptual, philosophical, theoretical, methodological tools, which of course the scientists themselves, they have them, they can use them, but often we have a different way of using them because we have a different background, because we have a different way of thinking about those things. And I would say that, the difference is making a difference. Is that if you want to make a difference, intervene in science, this is more philosophy in science.
Fantastic clarification. I think, so some of my work that I'm hoping to do and as I'm working on is more of in terms of descriptive. It's really trying to make sense. It's trying to say, right, this is, I'm interested in integration in psychiatric science, approaches toward integrating and combining different kinds of perspectives. There's a lot of different kinds of approaches. And so my initial project is to do this kind of descriptive work where ideally this would provide some sort of clarification or we have some understanding. That being said, it's not clear that is going to have, at least on its own, an interventionist kind of bent to it. It's not going to make things aren't going to necessarily change right away. So do you see a connection then between, I suppose, a starting point of descriptive work then leading into intervention, or do you see, I don't know, I guess, do you see some folks doing, because I think you're right, there's a lot of, for example, I think in practice case studies where there's a lot of, descriptive work being done, but then maybe it doesn't always translate. I guess I'm curious is how much do you see any of this in science work being built on some of the descriptive work that is being done by other philosophers of science?
Yes. So I do think that having some level of description is indispensable. So either it's done by the philosopher in science himself or herself. I mean, she does the descriptive part and then the interventionist part. That's one option. Another option is to use the descriptive work done by others. And I think we are going in that direction at the moment because there are so many interesting things going on in philosophy of science at the moment, which really open up our perspectives, but also the very scientific fields on which we work. I think we have been for a long time very conservative. Now I mean, you find philosophy of science about now so many different scientific fields.
Yeah.
That's I think is absolutely fantastic, because it really widens our perspectives, and I think that is very important. So often I think that the work has been done or is currently being done by others, and interventionism probably requires at least some level of description. So I don't think that you can do some good intervention if you don't know not only the science itself, but how the science is being done. So to me, for example, it's made a big difference to join a scientific lab where in front of my office, it is a lab. I mean, it is an actual lab. So I see them working, I can go there, I can talk with them. And this really made a difference to my work, even though before joining this lab, I was already writing papers in science journals, for example. You know, the difference was, okay, I need to understand not only the science, but also the practices to then try to maybe suggest ways of modifying them, changing them, maybe enriching them if possible.
Fantastic. All right. Well, Thomas, thank you so much for taking this time to offer your, your wisdom and your understanding and description of your work. Really fascinating stuff going on. Is there anything else we didn't quite get to, or anything else you'd like to leave us with? Maybe some, news of upcoming research or conferences, anything of that nature?
Well, if it doesn't sound like advertisement of any sort, we have our next Philosophy in Biology and Medicine conference.
Great! Yeah.
In Bordeaux in October, and we will have Elliot Sober. I mentioned him before, and Eugene Koonin, who is a very major biologist in the U.S. And we have a call for papers. And our aim is just to have fun putting together scientists, philosophers, and medical doctors, and really see how we can really work together to again make a difference to the science. So it's the same idea, but simply we have this conference, and if some people are interested in joining us, well, they are very welcome.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll hopefully maybe put a link in the show notes. But anyway, thank you so much, Thomas. Have a wonderful rest of your day. It was really great getting to chat. I will be really looking further into the philosophy in science work. I really hope to see some more publications and or just efforts to kind of make explicit this kind of approach and how it differs from the in practice approach. I think that will be really useful. So thank you very much. And very much. It was nice talking to you. Have a good rest of the day. Hope to run into you at a conference at some point. So that will be great.
That would be great. Okay.
All right. Thank you, Thomas. Bye-bye.
Thank you.